the first thing that I'm going to go over is the anatomy of a shadow. And last week I had you all draw an egg that had some pretty heavy shadows on it. And so this week I'm going to talk about the different parts of a shadow because shadows always behave in predictable ways. So when you drew the egg, I wanted you to investigate how to use the materials a little bit better and for you to start paying more attention to dark and light. And today I'm going to go over the actual components of the shadows that you'll be drawing. So with round objects, the different parts of the shadow will look like this. For the one of the exercises this week, you'll be drawing a sphere in shadow, a cone in shadow, and a cube in shadow, and naming and labeling the parts. And so a sphere is going to look very similar to this egg. So the first part of the shadow I want to highlight is the highlight. And so the highlight is here on this egg. And when we say the word highlight, when we're describing shadow and light, the highlight is the part of the object that is facing the light source, that it actually has light on the surface of the object. The next part of the shadow I want to talk about is the core shadow. So when we talk about the core shadow, we're talking about the shadow on the object itself. So it's the shadow on the object itself. The next part is the cast shadow, which is the shadow that the object casts in the environment that it's on. So the cast shadow is actually on the plate and the core shadow is on the egg. The last part I've labeled here for you is the occlusion shadow. And so the occlusion shadow is the darkest part of the cast shadow, and it's where the core shadow and the cast shadow overlap. So the shadow is usually darkest, closest to the object, and it'll get lighter as it gets further from the object. So there's a couple of things here I want to point out that aren't labeled. Another part of shadow anatomy is the terminator point, and that is happening along this curve here. The terminator point is when the highlight transitions to the core shadow. At that point, that is the terminator point. And if it's a cube, there are multiple terminator points. Another aspect of shadows that I want you all to pay attention to is the cast shadow gets more diffuse as it gets further away from the object. So you can see the edge of the cast shadow is a lot sharper as it's closer to the egg. And as it gets further away, it gets less and less sharp. So I want you to pay attention to these things because even if your viewer doesn't know what you're drawing, because shadows and light always behave in the same way, they can psychologically tell if something's been drawn correct spatially or not, just because we're so familiar to how shadows and form work. So you want to really pay attention to the sort of diffusion of shadows. Is it sharp? Is it more diffuse? And the darkness of shadows, matching the darkness of shadows, and also where they are. Because if a shadow is in a slightly different shape or place, it's communicating a different form. So that's why it's so important to pay attention to shadows. And also the darkness too. You could get the shape of a shadow perfect, but if it's not dark enough, it's not communicating the proper space. It's not going to push back far enough in the illusionary space. So those are some things to look out for. With a faceted object like a cube, you have similar anatomy with the shadow. So you've got the highlight where the light source is hitting and the cube's going to be brightest. But then in addition to the same parts of the shadow that the egg had, you also have what's called a halftone. And so what the halftone is that it is the cube partially in shadow because it's not directly facing the light source like the highlight is, but it's not the opposite side of the cube where the darkest shadow is in the core shadow. And so you get a mid-tone, a half-tone that's not as light as the highlight and not as dark as the core shadow side. So that's important as a distinction for any sort of faceted object with sides. So then you have the cast shadow of the cube, the occlusion shadow, where those overlap, the core shadow and the cast shadow, and it's darkest here, the core shadow. And something also that you should look out for is on the darkest part of the core shadow on your object, oftentimes you get reflected light from the environment bouncing off and creating a bit of lightness. So you should look out for that. I'm going to jump back to the egg. This is reflected light. So the darkest shadows actually appear because the reflected light from the plate is bouncing up. And so with a cube, you can expect some reflected light in the darkest part of the core shadow as well. So another difference between a faceted object and a round one is the terminator points here on this cube. They're multiple, and they are the edges where the highlighted side becomes the other sides that are in halftone or core shadow. So that's where the terminator point is along this perimeter. So this next image I have for you is a quick sketch I did to show you that depending on where your light source is, that the direction of the shadow is going to correspond to the direction of the light source. So you can see here, the sun is shining on this figure from the left, and so the shadow is being projected out from the right. In this middle diagram, the sun is directly above the person, so there's just a small shadow right below. And then the figure on the right is being lit from the right, and so the shadow is being cast to the left of the figure. And also depending on the height or how low the light source is, that's going to affect the shape and direction of the shadow as well. And then below the first diagram, I have three little egg shapes, and this is to communicate that the closer the light source is, the darker the shadow becomes. And so this little egg on the right, that would denote that the light source is closer to it. As you've noticed by now, you have to put your light pretty close to your objects in order to create heavy shadows. And so this one on the left has the light source furthest away, and so it has the faintest shadows, and this is somewhere in between. I want to show you all one of my favorite drawing techniques, which is laying a ground. And what laying a ground means is that before you even start working on your drawing, you have material on the page. One of the biggest mistakes that beginning drawers will make is they leave too much of the white of the page if they're trying to create a realistic space. If you leave too much white on the page, the white of the page doesn't communicate any information to the viewer. If you heavily restrict where the white of the page appears, it becomes very specific in the information that it communicates. It will denote a highlight or the lightest part of your environment or subject. And so one way, oh God, the squeak. One way to get around that is to start from a ground, which allows you to erase out and create light moments as well as darker moments on the ground from the very get-go. It saves a lot of time and helps the drawing be more convincing spatially much quicker. So forgive the squeaking. I'm going to lay down some material. Make sure that you always lay ground on a smooth surface. And this can be done in graphite as well. You need to use the side of your pencil and then use a paper towel to wipe the material and get rid of this texture. And so I'm going to lay down a ground that I'll use to demonstrate your first exercise. So as I mentioned earlier, you want to work material into the page, and it'll take away some of the texture. A ground can be laid with compressed charcoal as well. I'm on the newsprint, so it's only going to take so much of a beating. And you can see that there's a bit of texture coming through from my board, so you want to be careful and make sure you're on a smooth surface. And so what I'm going to do is apply one more coat of the soft charcoal. Okay. And then I'm going to use my paper towel to just work it into the page a little bit. And now I'm ready to start. For your first exercise this week, you're going to have to recreate the 3 images I placed in the week folder of a sphere in shadow, a cone in shadow, and a cube in shadow. And so I recommend that you set a ground before you start those drawings. And it takes quite a bit of time to build up enough material and cover that ground, but it is possible. And just, I want to point out that if you lay a ground down in graphite, charcoal has a very difficult time adhering to it. So I would stick only to graphite if, for the drawing, if you lay down a graphite ground. Graphite can go down on top of a charcoal ground with mixed results, but I wouldn't do it the other way around. So I'm going to demonstrate the cone drawing and how to work from a ground for you. So you can't see, but I'm looking at the same image of a cone that I've put into your folder for the week. And I just want to show you first that when you lay down a ground, you can actually erase to create your lines. So I'm going to trace in the air to figure out what the angle is of my cone. I'm looking at it. And if you're no matter what you're looking at for reference, it should be as close to the drawing as possible. So if I wasn't shooting this video, my computer would be right here next to the drawing, because the less time it takes to look between the two, the better the connection you're making between them. So, all right, so I'm gonna erase out for my lines. I've got the angle of my cone confidently. And just another thing to keep in mind, I'm only drawing the cone, but I want you all to try to place all three objects on the same page. So you would not want to stick one in the direct center, perhaps. So also keep in mind, I want you to draw the cast shadow that's in the environment. So leave room for that as well. So I'm erasing my ground for the cone. And there are some things, some rules of logic you can use, especially when what you're drawing is a simple shape, because we know that this cone is bilaterally symmetrical. We know that it should be symmetrical from left to right. And so you can use just logical reasoning like that to help fix your drawing. So now I'm going to erase out the line for the bottom of my cone. And for the cone, I want you to pay close attention. It's not a straight line across. That would just be a triangle. Because it's a rounded cone, it's actually curved. And so it's actually an ellipse that is lowest at the center point. And so that line needs to be adjusted a little bit to show that. And so what I like about using the ground and erasing out for lines is it's the easiest thing in the world to wipe this away. Whereas a drawn line, even with light pressure, can leave a trace. And so it's quicker, it's neater, and it's easier to make changes. So now that I'm happy with not happy with the line work, I'm going to check it. The left and the right side of the cone should be at the equal place, an equal place. And so this needs to come down. Okay. I also want you to use this exercise to practice hard edges and smooth blending. But first you need to get your lines in. And then now I'm going to look at where the highlight is. Now I'm confident in the shape of my cone. So I'm going to erase out for the highlight. And the highlight is the brightest part of this. I'm going to switch to my compressed charcoal and white charcoal now that I can commit a little bit more to this drawing. And so one thing to keep in mind is that if you're going to jump materials, they don't always match. And so you always want to pay attention to that. Sometimes it requires slipping in a bit of one material into places that may not necessarily need it, but just to kind of integrate it into the drawing so it doesn't stick out. So another thing I want to show you is I'm actually curving the strokes of my charcoal. It helps support the rounded form of the cone as opposed to going straight across, which would really flatten it. So now I've got some compressed charcoal on. I'm going to move it around with my finger a bit. And I'm working pretty carefully right now. I'll commit more once I'm happy with how it's proceeding. You can always add more darkness. You can always make changes. So you don't have to go in full force right away. So after I put that down and wiped it, I want the core shadow to be darker than it currently is. And I'm not going to make it darkest at the far end because we've actually got reflected light bouncing up over here. And so I'm just going to darken the darkest part of the core shadow as I see it in the diagram. And I'm actually blending it with a bit of a curve to my stroke to help support the form. So there is some charcoal on my finger. So I'm actually going to use that small amount to bring in some shadow over here, creeping, because the lightest part of my cone is not the far end, it's this strip here. So I'm going to lay down a bit of material there. And I'm going to compare it to the diagram. I lost my highlight, which starts at the very tip. Re-erase that. Drawing is definitely about building up the material, about kind of pushing and pulling those highlights back and the shadows dark enough. And oftentimes when you make one adjustment, sometimes you go a little too far. So I'm using my eraser to gently remove some material. Notice that it was dirty. You can use it that way. I'm using my clean finger to wipe away some of the material away from that highlighted area. Okay, so I'm mildly satisfied with this. I'm going to re-carve out that highlight again at its brightest point, and it goes all the way to the bottom of that highlight. I'm actually gonna wipe my finger clean and then experiment, because I'm on the newsprint, with adding the white Conti actually for the brightest part of this. And I want to be really careful not to work any compressed charcoal dust from my dirty finger into that. So, just my thumb. So because the newsprint is not as light as the white Conti shows up pretty well to stand in for my brightest highlight. Okay. So next, I'm gonna put in my occlusion shadow. That's pretty wonky. As I mentioned before, we know this cone's symmetrical, so you can already tell that this is off. Adjust my cone, work this material into the form. And so as I continue to refine this, I want to make a decision to really bring out the form from the background. So let's get the cast shadow in next. And I actually just use my finger to wipe out those erased lines. So now let's get the cast shadow in based on the diagram. There is an angle, a direction to that shadow. So now that we've got our cast shadow, our occlusion shadow, highlight, and this shape, this edge is a little wonky here, so I'm just gonna apply the white to fix this contour and add a little bit more highlight to match the reference. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to hit some of this fuzziness because we want to create hard edges. So my cone is so dark over here that I'm confident that that's the right choice to really darken to create my edge up at the top. So I'm being really careful with where the material goes down. And then I will carefully. I'm not even going to touch the top edge of this because that's what I want to be sharp. So I'm just working this material into the body of the cone. So now there's a much sharper edge up here. And then on the other side of the cone, I think I would like to erase out to create the other sharp edge. And you want to be careful with newsprint because it's fragile. So I'm going to use one hand to brace the paper. So this is how you can use the eraser to help create a sharp boundary between your subject and its environment. Oops. And if your eraser is dirty, you can wipe it off on the bottom of your shoe or on, I don't know, I wipe it on the bottom of my shoe for some reason. You can also cut it and or rip it as I do, and that will leave you with a clean portion of the eraser to work with. So let's just tidy up over here at the shadow. It's a lot sharper at the edge here. And over here, clean up the occlusion shadow. So the only thing that you guys will have to do once you've got the drawing to a point similar to this is then actually label the parts. So you can do this with the pencil or with the eraser. Charcoal, whatever you like. So, and practice on sharpness, on smooth blending, and then you can label. So I would just put a line, highlight, and the terms I want you to put are on the images that you're going to be drawing for reference in that folder. I think that you get the idea.